and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women whose ideas, vision and philosophy help define our contemporary world. My guest today is a writer by vocation and a diplomat by profession. He's written extensively for publications as varied and rich as the Times Literary Supplement, the London Magazine, the Hindustan Times as a student journalist. He's published at least 3 significant books, Life of Guru Nanak, Folktales from Poland, and We're Not Lovers, Just Like That, a novel that was published some years ago. He served in the Foreign Office in countries as diverse as Moscow and Washington, Tehran and Thimphu, and of course is currently most familiar to television audiences as India's spokesperson for the Ministry of External Affairs. I'm delighted to welcome Navtej Sarna. You're really here as an incarnation, as a writer, and we've been planning this interview for a long while.
Yes.
And so we're a bit late in the day. Your last novel was published some time ago and was extremely well received. And I felt a great affinity to the novel. It's set in, much of it is set in Delhi, the university, familiar landmarks, Khan Market, Defense Colony, Tughlakabad, and what have you. I really should preface this conversation with saying that what I enormously enjoyed about the book was, and it's difficult to write a book that the people who are familiar with the terrain are reading, was the enormous quality of ease. And if I dare describe it as great literature, or at least potentially great literature, was the fact that it was significant and it was profound in very simple, elegant ways. It wasn't straining to be clever, as a lot of distinguished Indian writing is. Was that a conscious attempt to just be you, to be in a sense of flow that the novel captures?
Well, I'm sure I do know that the book was something which was and has been and is very dear to me. And in many ways it was a book which I felt for many years that I had to write. So much of it was written as it came, and therefore if you do find that it wasn't strained, I'm very glad, because I did find myself writing it almost straight off the bat. And it did go through its normal editing processes, but not too much.
What was the impulse to write? You come from a family of writers. Your mother's a well-known translator. Your father was a distinguished Punjabi writer. Just something you grew up with, and an imperative that you had something to say, something to get out of your system, the romantic notion of a writer getting through, experiencing catharsis.
Well, yes, we in our family, we often refer to each other as one tortured soul after another. But I did grow up amongst books. I mean, in my family, in my parents' home, the biggest thing was to be reading or writing, and one sort of grew up like that. One started writing as a student, as a kind of semi-professional journalist, and you just carried on because you sort of got into one form and you sort of tried to experiment with another form, and you grew into another form. I went from journalism, I went to short stories, and when I found that short stories were very nice, but no publisher was willing to touch them with a barge pole. And every publisher had this very nice paragraph which said that, oh, I love your short stories, they are so nice, but will you please give me a novel, as if a novel was just sitting in my bag. And thereafter I felt that I should try my hand at a novel. And when I had a lot to write about in a particular story which came out as We Weren't Lovers Like That, and if all of Delhi and all of one's childhood and youth wanted to go into it, and so I just let it.
It's a sort of almost a silly kind of elemental question, perhaps, but why do you write? Why didn't you just become a writer instead of a diplomat?
Yes, that's a question one always asks oneself, but then some things are sort of get set in life far earlier. If I had probably done a novel when I was 20, then I may never have become a diplomat. But I became a diplomat short of 22 years, by which time my writing was limited to an occasional piece in the evening news. So I obviously could not have lived by that. And if you will recall that in the 70s, journalism and writing was not what it is today in terms of developed profession, reasonable salaries, and big book advances, and so on and so forth. And it was still the pre-Salman Rushdie days. So one went into one of the traditional professions.
So if that advance was coming for your next book, and this is maybe an undiplomatic, unfair question to ask someone in government service, might you opt for it?
Well, you know.
Okay, I'll withdraw that question. You are working on a historical novel, or at least you've been quoted that you were. And what is that about, and what are the promptings to go back into history?
I'll wait till the novel is finished to say exactly what it is about. But yes, it is. I find that our history, in particular, and I am particularly fascinated by our recent history, which is last, let's say, the colonial period. There are a number of characters, a number of very important personalities whose stories have not been told, or if they have been told, they have not been told by Indians. So you have a number of books written by British writers, etc., but which invariably come with their inherent biases. So the prompting here is actually to depict a personality who I felt has not been depicted by an Indian.
You can't divulge who that personality is.
Not yet.
All right, okay. We have this sort of, a romantic notion that, you write because you have something to say. You want to change the world, you want to communicate, you want that communication to be received. And I guess that's sort of a much easier, that very sort of simplistic notion when you're doing, as you did, a biography of, the book of Nanak. And there's a philosophy, and you become a medium to communicate and transmit that. When you did your novel, there are lots of sort of bits and pieces of wisdom and insight that emerge from it. But what was was there a guiding message, a point that you wish to make? Was there, some trigger? I don't know what. Your struggle. Did you feel pressures that you must sit for the civil service and succeed, or failed relationships? Very often there are triggers in one's own life.
Yes.
that lead to a piece of writing, a piece of art, and then you circumscribe it with a story. So
if I read your question right, it is like how much of it is autobiography.
Well, it's a polite way of asking you that.
Yeah, well, I think it'd be fair and straightforward answer that all writing is to a large extent based on your own experiences. It doesn't necessarily mean that you must have gone through exactly the same incidents, or you must have met exactly the same kind of person. But very often you have seen very close, you have felt something, and then you have seen different people, and when you actually begin to write and fiction emerges, a lot of it seems to melt. And I found that, I found people melting, 5 people melting into one, and the rest being imagination. And you see a gesture here, you hear a voice here, you hear a conversation there, and somewhere 20 years down the line when you're writing, you don't know where that came from, but it
Actually,
comes.
the question was pushing you further, and that is really that often an artist, a painter or a filmmaker or even a novelist will say, well, this novel grew out of a catalyst or trigger, was a particular experience, or it was a particular need to say something, like you've talked about a historical novel that you feel you want to set the record right and what have you. Was there a particular trigger? Was it that as you implied that, look, you were writing short stories, you were writing good short stories, publisher says, look, this is not going to work, you say, okay, let me do a novel.
No, it's not as simple as that. I think a novel grows in you for many years. A novel grows in you. You have the experiences of your youth. you have failures which you have accumulated, you have pressures which you have experienced, you have people you have known, you have people you have met, forgotten, lost, got to know, got on with, you've made friends, you've made enemies, and actually there are, I think everybody, more so a writer, and perhaps they say everybody, has a story which he needs to get out there, whether it's an emotional cleansing, whether it is an unblocking of your creative paths, whether it is, and you continue to feel that unless that is written, you cannot get on to writing anything else.
You're watching a conversation with Navtej Sarna, writer, novelist, essayist, diplomat. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Navtej Sarna, author and diplomat. You were just talking about this process of a story that we all have within us. Does that make the second novel or the second piece of work, in some senses, more difficult, more substantial, more considered, more self-conscious?
I think probably most of that. It certainly makes it more considered. It certainly makes it in many ways easier, because you know that you have a book out already. You know that you may not get that huge advance, but you'll probably find a publisher. And you know that you're working towards a target. You've been through the process of actually putting together a book. The first time is very different. The first time you are actually writing blind, and you have these great moments of complete and hopeless doubt. You know, when you wake up in the morning and you look at the 150 pages and you've done it, nobody can possibly be interested in this. And there are days when you have to kick yourself into saying, no, you just have to go on. So ultimately what happened to me is that when I was doing my first book, I decided that I am going to do it whether it is published or not. So you reconcile to yourself to that idea that you have to get this out there whether or not it is ever published or read by anybody. If it is, well and good. That problem you don't face with the second book. So in many ways it becomes more of a craft than it has been in your first book, which is a tremendous adventure.
Tell us about the biography of Guru Nanak. And I guess that in some ways there are resonances between doing a historical
yes.
piece of fiction and well, I don't even know if I should call it fiction. I don't know what the novel is about, but let's say based on history in some ways. Tell us that how important, how personal was the book on Guru Nanak for you?
The Guru Nanak book was a straightforward assignment from Penguin, because they were in the middle of this series of. They had a series of Indian gods, then they moved on to Indian saints, and in that series they wanted a very quick and a very their stress was on a readable narrative, a book on Guru Nanak, and I had 3 or 4 months at my disposal. I was between jobs. I had 3 months of leave, so I said sure. And then I thought it would be fairly easy. But then I ran up against all sorts of problems. There is very little genuine historical material available on Guru Nanak's life. Everything that he has written is available, and that is above controversy, that is above dispute whether he has written it or not, because ultimately it's fairly recent, 500 odd years. But very little exists on his life. So when you have to write a life and times and teachings of, the life part becomes fairly difficult. So ultimately you have to piece together what is there in his writings, whatever is there from historical writing, and you have to use your own discrimination that, well, this year he went there, this year he went there. Between this, it is likely that he went there. And so you take a very reasonable middle of the road path, so to speak, and decide that this it could have been a fact and this is mythology. So and it was a very interesting process. I learned a huge amount. I read everything that had been, virtually everything that has been written on him in English, which doesn't amount to much, but 20 odd books.
From the learning that the process of writing was, and inevitably will aid and help other things that you do. What did you learn about Guru Nanak? In what ways has it impacted and influenced you?
I think I realized the huge wealth that exists in his writing, because and in his poetry. He was a poet of tremendous accomplishment, which very often even we who are essentially Punjabi speaking, Gurumukhi reading, faith following people, very often much that you hear, you don't even understand, you don't analyze. People start praying from the Guru Granth Sahib by rote almost. But when I decided that for better or for worse, whatever I would do would be my own translations. So when I sat down line after line of translating some of the hymns, I realized the absolute exceptional nature of his grasp of nature, of human nature, of beauty, of the endlessness of this universe, and how he translates that into pure poetry. That was one major realization, besides of course the truths which is talked. Sorry.
But what has that done to you as a human being? In what ways do you feel impacted, transformed, changed?
I mean, well, it humbled me to begin. It humbled me that a man could in that day and age travel so much on foot in an age of extremist religious thought on one side and dark and ritualism on the other side. He could, by very simple ways and very simple words, bring both sides out into some sort of a rational world. So it essentially humbled me. It brought to me home the fact that there was such a huge amount that one did not know even about one's own religion.
So as an element or as a part of your Sikh identity, what are some of the key elements for you? What does it mean? What does it feel to be a Sikh, apart from the visible symbol of it?
Yeah, I think the visible symbols are the least important.
Exactly.
I think I'm proud to be heir of tradition in a way, or part of a tradition in a way which is based on simplicity, which is based on rationality, which is based on a sense of community,
deep tolerance,
which is based on tolerance, which is based on the fact that there are many paths to God, and no path is above the other. And what is really important in I feel even today, when again you see all across the world, you see various forms of fundamentalism, various sort of divides emerging all over again, which perhaps even 20, 30 years ago we thought had vanished forever. In this day and age, if you can find teachings or practices which talk of equality, which talk of sharing, which talk of tolerance, which talk of all men being equal.
What does being a practicing Sikh for you involve? Rituals, practices, we've touched on identity.
Yeah.
What are some of the elements that are
Well, for me as a practicing Sikh, it's a very simple existence. I am not overtly religious in the sense of following certain practices every day. I do not have that sort of commitment, if you say that I must follow A, B, C, D and everything, but I try to stick to the essential elements of which I have just talked about. And if one can do that, I think it's quite something for oneself, if not for anybody else.
You're watching a conversation with Navtej Sarna, author, writer, essayist, diplomat, spokesperson for the Ministry of External Affairs of the Government of India. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Navtej Sarna, perhaps most familiar in recent years as the voice of the Ministry of External Affairs, as its spokesperson. But we'll come to that in a moment. Let's just look at your career as a diplomat. What have been its gratifications, and in what ways has this changed? You know, we're more or less sort of contemporaries at university, and in one's youth, that was sort of the most aspired for profession. You sat for the civil services, and if you were somewhere near the top, you joined the foreign service. No longer the case.
Yeah.
So, in what ways, and why? In what ways, you know, were you drawn to it, and why do you think that aspiration has changed?
Well, you asked me a few questions ago, you asked me if I had a chance to be a writer then, would I have been a writer then? Well, I'll be honest about it. I did have other choices when I was, when I got the foreign service. But again, the impulse to write was very strong. And in those days, maybe one was naive, one really felt that one needed to see a lot before writing, or maybe one was not, because there are writers of all kinds, people who can sit on one desk in one small room and write about the whole universe.
There was also so much prestige in being selected for the Indian Foreign Service.
That was there, but that was there. But then also the service offered a life of, you know, exploring unknowns, a life of moving from culture to culture, a life of going from country to country. And I must say that I have not been disappointed even one single day in 26 years. And I think I owe a huge amount to the service and for the kind of exposure that it gave me, the kind of opportunities that it gave me to not only touch cultures fleetingly, but to live in a culture, to internalize it, to learn its languages, to learn its patterns, to learn its history. So I think every country that I have been through has enriched me hugely and left behind some kind of bags of emotional wealth, you know, which you can draw on.
Has it sometimes been sort of restrictive? You know, you're a diplomat. You know, you might feel. I'm not talking about you in particular, or you know, that would be an unfair question. But just generically, you know, being a diplomat, you know, representing your country in difficult, awkward, sensitive situations, you actually want to say something, you know, tell a guy to get off. You can't. You may have to put forth a point of view that you don't entirely agree with because it's a job. Is that a problem, you think?
Well, I think that those are the given constraints of any profession. There are some do's and don'ts, and once you have taken on a profession, you have to live within those constraints, or you shouldn't be there at all. So there has been, you know, this you internalize. This becomes part of your training: how to speak, how to interact with people, what are the things you will not say, what are the things you will say, and after all, you are part of a service whose job it is to represent India abroad, and you have no business to be doing anything else.
You know, you're the spokesperson for the Ministry of External Affairs, and I guess that, you know, that in the context that we speak is perhaps the most challenging, demanding in a position in terms of being the public face. Certainly at the senior middle level or the middle senior level of the service. What is how difficult, how challenging? What's the kind of how do you prepare? Give us a sense of the processes. You get briefed. You you plan the language, you agree upon that internally before you go out and face the press?
Well,
what happens?
I think a lot of preparation goes into this, and it's not only an individual's preparation, it's the preparation of the ministry or the relevant parts of the ministry. The fact is that an interface with the media for the foreign ministry has become extremely important. We have all realized this because the interplay between foreign policy and media has become that much more intense in the last few years with the coming of television, with so many channels, with breaking news and everything. So a lot of preparation goes into deciding what the media, what is to be said to the media, how it is to be said to the media, what are the points that we need to project more, what are the points that we can't project, because there are certain elements which you can't put into the public domain. So yes, on most issues you have to be briefed by the relevant divisions in the ministry.
Specialists in the area.
Yes, people who deal with a certain area, naturally, so I have to go to them and ask them, what do you think I should say on this afternoon? And then appropriate approvals have to be taken for what is to be said. Sometimes you get a very broad line that this is it, and then you have to tread the path of the actual words between that broad line. Sometimes when, depends if things are extremely significant, you have an actual chapter and verse and which you have to then stick to very closely.
Right.
And then there are always the questions which sometimes are along expected paths. Sometimes
they just sprung at you.
They're a huge ambush, and then you have to be dead or ducking.
Well, tell me. I mean, I guess the natural, the evolution or the aspiration of someone in the Foreign Service is to be, an ambassador to Washington, to be Foreign Secretary or whatever. So I shan't go into that. But what about a personal ambition, a personal aspiration, not just in the context of a job, but Navtej Sarna, human being, retired 58, 60.
Well, I have...
or earlier if you get this big advance, may or may not. But what remains that sort of, that great dream to one day do?
Well, it's...
or accomplish?
My personal ambitions are entirely and almost totally restricted to my writing. And it is to write a better book than my last one. So if I can carry on doing that, I see myself not wanting to do much else when I have the time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a great pleasure.
Bye-bye. Thank you.